Hello, and welcome to the Hunter Bond podcast, where I get the opportunity to speak to some of the key players and leaders within the world of finance, technology, and recruitment. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Bhairav Patel. Bhairav has a wealth of experience in technical and leadership roles and has been the CTO of a number of innovative fintechs. He's currently the MD of Atom Ventures, who helps startups and small businesses with their technology, providing virtual CTO services. And he's also the CTO of Defactor, which is a platform built on the blockchain that is looking to bridge the gap between traditional finance and the exciting decentralized finance space. Firstly, Bhairav, thank you so much for joining me. And how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I should get you to write my bio because you've kind of done it better than I can.
That's all right. I do biographies on the side, so we can have a chat about that later on. But no, thank you so much for joining. There's a lot I want to talk about today. Your career has spanned from working in very large sort of international businesses, both on the technology and leadership side of things, and then of course in this sort of startup cultures and businesses. And I'd like you to go a lot into a bit of detail about your career and where you've got to today. But you've also worked internationally with lots of different cultures, building international teams. And I hope a lot of people can kind of get, something out of your experiences and what you kind of learned along the way. But yeah, please give us a bit of insight into how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so I started off, I actually did a law degree back in the day. I didn't want to become a lawyer, decided that wasn't the thing for me. Ended up looking at lots of different kinds of areas, sectors, marketing, things like GlaxoSmithKline back in those days to advertising. Eventually found a job at PwC, IT consulting. I'd always been interested in tech from a young age anyway. And this was a way for me to get involved in technology, but also travel. So that was one of the key things. And actually from day one, I was sent out to Lithuania in '99. We were building a technology platform for the local telecoms provider. So think of BT,
Okay.
equivalent in Lithuania telecoms. So we built that. And then for, I guess, the first half of my career, about 5-6 years, I can't remember now how many years it was now, that I was working at PwC and then IBM. IBM bought up PwC Consulting.
Right.
And then I went off and, I was living in Norway, came back to the UK to work for IBM, then realized I don't really want to be in the UK. Ended up going back to Norway as a consultant and then lived there for another 5-6 years. So I think in total, I lived in Norway for about 11 years. And then working. So I became the CTO for an e-commerce business back in 2008. We grew that. That grew quite nicely, quite massively. We had 3 different brands within that e-commerce business, so 3 different kinds of shops. And we took that out from Norway to Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. So actually it was operationally in Germany, but selling in Denmark. And then just as I left, actually went to Sweden, then became CTO for a fintech back in 2013 when fintech was just a new thing. So we raised 12 million back in those days. And over the next 5-6 years, we grew that again globally. So we scaled that to have operations so we had the base in Ireland, we had Singapore, South Africa at one point, and then 3 different parts of the US, and it scaled that team up, became Forbes FinTech 50 business, which is very nice with the likes of Stripe and Acorn, which was great. And then I left that, ended up with a stint in Thailand, in Bangkok, working for an e-commerce business out there, and then started Atom Ventures, which is now really Atom CTO. So the whole story behind Atom Ventures / Atom CTO was that during these past 20 years, we'd been myself and the rest of the guys who formed Atom Ventures had been working with startups and advising them, right? Really advising early stage startups, and we saw the same problems over and over again. I mean, the problems that happen in tech for large companies are the same as in small companies. They're just smaller because there's not much, there's not much more. There's not much meat in the bones. Yeah, infrastructure. So we really started it as a way of giving top quality advice to early stage startups, right? To help founders navigate the waters when it comes to tech and understand, okay, how do you build a strategy? How do you execute that strategy? How do you make sure that what you're getting is right? Because we always ask the same questions always asked the same question by founders, but also saw the same problems, right? That projects overran, so they took too long, they cost too much money, people didn't get what they want. Founders always found that they kind of had to change everything within the first 6 months, and they were saddled with lots of technical debt. And you saw these problems, and you realize that actually a lot of it can be dealt with very early on. So once you talk to the founders, understand their business, understand where they're trying to go, create a right strategy and roadmap, and actually articulate the features of the product that they want to build in a way that developers can understand. Because that's what we were very good at as a team. We obviously understand the technical language, but we also understand the language of business. which I think is something that's weirdly not improved over the years. I would have thought it had, but for some reason, those worlds seem to remain apart.
Yeah, aligning that technology side of things with the business is so important, especially if the product is tech heavy. Were you finding that a lot of founders or people you're working with were more business focused and didn't necessarily have that kind of technology nous or background, and just had a product, had an idea, but didn't know how to quite execute it properly? Or
Yeah, so I think most founders are generally good at one or two things, right? And the reason they start that company is because they've been doing that one or two things, those one or two things for a long time, and feel that they see a need in the market. So they may be great at sales, or maybe great operationally with running a business, or they may actually be a techie with an idea for a great product. But a startup is as I keep saying to the founders, an app is not a business.
yeah,
Right, you need to think beyond just the technology that you're building and how you're supporting from a customer perspective, sales, marketing, advertising, all of these different things that you need to have involved. And I think that's what we bring to the table. We tell them, given our experience building businesses, we say to them, yeah, technology is just one of the pieces of your toolkit, right? It's a tool for the business. It's not the business itself. No matter what you are, even if you're one of the big fintech banks, right, that are all tech heavy, they still employ a huge number of people. And they all must be doing something, which is the KML, KYC, AML, all those kinds of different things in there. So what the way that we have a very set methodology that we've used over the years, and we stick to that. What I guess we find very hard is to articulate to the founders and the startup owners that they need this process, because
the importance
oftentimes, what tends to happen is
they ask for your advice and then dismiss your advice because it might be too costly or too timely.
Yeah. And then they come back again after they spent a huge amount of money and say, well, it's all broken now. How do we fix it? Well, if you'd gone down our path very early on, you would have had, it may not have been perfect, but it would have been much better than where you're at now. And I think that's the key. Most people, when they start a business, because you have a limited set of money, you feel that you want to spend it in the right way, but they don't see planning as the right way, which is odd, because they just want to get out there.
A lot of short-term thinking and being more responsive rather than pragmatic.
It's that whole lean startup thing, which has created a kind of myth that you need to get out there and fail fast and reinvent, which is there to a point, but actually the most successful startups that I know go very slowly, right? They're very considered with each of their moves, and the ones that we work with, one of the reasons we work with them is because they understand that the business will take its own time, right? No matter what you do, you can't force customers to buy from you. It will take time for you to evolve that business and understand your market and really change your product to address that market. You can't force it down the throats of your customers, right?
Yeah, I've spoken to a number of startup founders recently, and everyone really does press on two things in particular. Is that when you are starting a startup, is that you need to have partners in all of these areas, whether it be legal, technical, business savvy, or marketing. So if for instance somebody has a great idea but not maybe the technical side of it, then someone, a company like yourselves and actually ensuring that you do have them partners in place for that advice and strategy is probably important. But the second thing has always been around the product, and not necessarily the innovation of the product, but the customer experience or the candidate experience. And if your product is an app or technology and it isn't following, it's a bit buggy or it's a bit slow process, you haven't put that time into market research or understanding what the candidate's needs are, the product's never going to go anywhere. So the technology is really important at the forefront if the product is very tech focused.
And I was listening to one of your previous podcasts with the guy from Currency, and he talked about how he got one of his investors because of the onboarding process being fantastic, right? But I guarantee you, and I'm sure he'll admit it, that took a long time. It wouldn't have been something that he would have done magically overnight that suddenly had an amazing process. And I think that's where people need to spend a lot of time. What we tend to say to startup founders is that if you can run this on a piece of paper, run it on a piece of paper. Because one of the issues that you have with tech is that people try to build too much tech too soon, and then you're stuck with it. And a lot of people talk about technical debt, but actually it's not necessarily technical debt. It's just building the wrong thing, right? Because you've anticipated something in the market, and what you haven't done is thought that actually maybe the market doesn't want all of that. Maybe they want 20% of it, right? And I think what people need to do is be more agile in the way of thinking when it comes to the actual product. There's so many times I've spoken to founders and we just don't work with them who say we need to have everything, because there's no point. We know it's going to cost you a couple $100,000, and actually you could have spent 30 grand and saved 170 and use that 170 to actually get the customers in.
And customers, as you say, you have an app or whatever it might be with hundreds of different features, and customers will only use a small part of that, and it's working out, well, where what are the customers or the candidate, what are they going to use most, and invest, all your efforts into that, and then grow from there, I guess.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things so just for the fintech that I worked at when I was CTO of that, the founders had gone and spent £1 million on building a platform. Now, I won't tell you who the developers were that I got handed, because I literally started on day one, and I was part of I was advising them before we launched, but I was having massive battles with the development team just to try and get things right. But as soon as we got it, what I said to the tech team was that, and I actually said to the business, is that, we're not going to build more until we see it in action. We're not going to change anything, because we know that, you might not like X, Y, and Z pieces of it all, but we don't know, right? Because you might not like it, but the customers might like it. And so there's no point in us trying to tinker with it until we know what the feedback is. And we're not building a lot of the processes into the back end until we understand where the pain points in the processes are. Because, what we found was that what people thought that they needed is, in practice, when you go, like, if you've got a team of 10, your problems are going to be different from when you've got a team of 100, right? And I hate to use the term economies of scale, but the fact that, saving 100 people 10 minutes is huge time saver, right? Then maybe tweaking 20 minutes off one person when there's a group of 10 of you. So that's the thing. And I think people try to dive in too quickly, and they really need to take a step back.
So, yeah, and again, I think going back to the conversation I had with James, I think a big part of what he spoke about was the research side of it, and not necessarily getting a product out as quickly as possible, but at least getting a prototype and having friends, family, a small network of people try it, get their feedback on board, tweak it, and then really invest in what's important from that. So yeah, I mean, if that's the advice that you'd give, as well as other people I've spoken to, I think take a bit of a step back before trying to rush things out to the market, and make sure you've done that sort of research and gathered your data and investing in the right areas.
And ideally get someone else to do it for you, right? Because the problem is, as a founder, you'll only listen to you'll end up having a filter in your head. You'll only listen to the things that you think are good, right?
Well, I think
and actually won't really listen.
Yeah. So whether we use like hire someone specifically to do that, or you think like a third party outsource, I think a custom review type.
Yeah, there are companies that do it, right? So there'll be designers that can do it for you. They'll go out and then they'll kick you out the room and they'll talk direct to the user. So that if you've got a designer with you, then they should be able to do this as well. Or you can just, get someone else to run a workshop. And it's very simple.
Yeah.
Come up with some questions and then listen to the feedback.
So one thing you also touched on as well, and I did want to come back to this, but you mentioned about, potentially as a CTO joining the business with a development team, you didn't necessarily, maybe not necessarily get on with, but you felt like there was issues from day one. What would you still do that again? Like, or how do you deal with a challenging situation like that coming into a business and then having,
So actually, that with the fintech, what happened there was that there was another third-party company that had built it, and the whole point was that they were going to build it, and then they were going to stay on, and I just got rid of them and brought in my own team.
Okay.
Because it was just there was no working relationship, right? And it did mean that I had to work very hard, but it got us to where we needed to get to much quicker, much cheaper than we would have done. But I had another situation where I ended up having to go in, and we fired half of the IT department as soon as I got there, right, within the first month, and we just got rid of half of the IT department, which dramatically improved the quality of output and actually reduced the number of production issues and speed to market. So sometimes in that sense I inherited a team, just had to get rid of the people that were actually causing the problems, and you could see that quite clearly of who that was and why they're doing it. And they weren't all working towards the best interest of the company. They're working to the best interest of themselves.
Right.
And
So when you enter a new business and there's an existing development team, you think always assess the development team you have there and potentially have to make some dramatic changes to move forwards, rather than be sort of
it's case by case, right? I mean, I'm trying to think. There's been a number of times when I've gone in and you've got a great team, right? And maybe the team is. Usually, I don't come into a situation unless there's a problem. Right. So there's usually a reason that I'm being brought in, unless it's, of course, with a lot of the companies we work with Atom CTO, where there is just nothing and they want to start from the ground up. But there's been a number of occasions in my career where I just get brought in to solve the issues. And And then you know that there's something that's broken, and it may not necessarily be the people. It's just the process and the way that people work, right? And how they've been treated. So a lot of times that, it's the people in front of you are great. They've just been either not given a chance, or they're not unmotivated, treated poorly.
Yeah. So what do you think is more difficult, coming into a business where, there's already, a product but there's issues and you have to firefight, or like Atom Venture coming when it's absolute greenfield, nothing there, and you can kind of build it from scratch?
I think obviously the greenfield is everyone's like joy. It's everyone's kind of, everyone wants to be in that situation.
For old code is the dream, I guess, of that.
But the thing with going a greenfield is that you've got more that can go wrong, right? So if you've got a product that already exists and is working, and it may not be doing everything in the right way, but it's serving your customer base and you're making some money, and a few tweaks here and there will make it better. That's actually a much easier situation to get to, even though it may sound more disastrous than going to a greenfield, because of the greenfield, you are making decisions that will impact the company for a couple of years, that where there is a huge unknown. It's actually very hard to develop something that is that will be flexible to the massive unknowns, because there's known unknowns and unknown unknowns and all those good things, right? And with a startup, they're pretty much mostly all unknown unknowns, right? You have an idea of your market, you have an idea of what your customers want, but until you're out there and with the MVP, you don't really know. And that's why I always try and emphasize that you build as little as possible to begin with, to get the people up and running, because as soon as you are up and running, things will change. I do not know to this day a startup that I've worked with or talked to who has been doing in the second 6 months of their existence the same as they've been doing in the first 6 months of their existence, right? It changes very, very quickly.
You have to be adaptable, don't you? You have to be, and to make dramatic changes sometimes. So how have you as well? So, as we're talking about Atom again, and you're coming into, different businesses that maybe already have different methodologies and thought processes and different cultures and stuff. Are you building teams, like you helping them build teams from scratch, and how do you deal with the different cultures and different challenges and whatnot when it comes to working in different environments?
So I guess there's two different aspects to that. There's culture from a actual culture perspective, that people are in different countries and think and behave, differently than others. And then there's the company culture. I think generally when you go into a business, everyone wants that business to succeed, unless there's some real weird politics going on, especially at a smaller level. So as long as you can convince everyone that what's happening in front of them is for the best of their business, and will inevitably increase their pay or value of what shares they have, then that's always a good thing. And I think typically early stage, if the founders don't know each other well and haven't really secured their shareholders agreement and haven't really figured out the way that they're going to work together, then you get a little bit of politics, right? And that's where things can get very messy very quickly. But I always whenever I say to anyone who's starting a business, the first thing I always say is just prepare for the bad times, right? Make sure that you've got your shareholders agreements in place, what roles and responsibilities everyone has, and ensure that if something does go wrong, there's a very clear plan of what to do about it. But then you've got the other cultural aspect, where people coming from different parts of the world and working together. And that, I guess because I've worked in so many different countries and worked with so many different types of people, it's kind of in a way, it's a bit natural. I can understand when people say one thing and mean something different to the way I would normally interpret it as a Brit. But you can see it happening, especially when I'm sitting there as an independent person watching two people. You can see it happening because there's just cross communication that sometimes happen. And really all the way to get around that is just to be very clear in what you want, and use very simple language, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of times I see this a lot in pitch decks. There's a lot of jargon used and a lot of abbreviations and acronyms. And I think if you don't create a common terminology, and any developer listening to this or any architect listening to this will understand, right? Unless you've got a common data dictionary, unless you've got a common terminology within the business, things get confusing very quickly. And you need to have that. And that's one of the key things you need to start off with. And then that helps iron out some of the other issues around the culture.
Yeah. So for someone like yourself, then you were touching on, teams internationally and whatnot, especially in startups. How much are you seeing that now then? Is that the kind of way that business is moving a lot, where we have the ability now with technology and to hire people remotely? You're finding that international teams is kind of the go-to, is it? Or
yeah, so it's an interesting one, right? So I think now COVID has obviously shown that people can work remotely from anywhere. There are always going to be those people that don't really want to have remote. They want to have someone in front of them, and that's never really going to go away. And actually there are certain industries where it's probably right. So betting and gaming, you kind of want to have people in front of you to share ideas and actually lock down some of the IP. But I definitely think that there is a much more of a move. You can see it in the market. You can see now that hiring developers is harder. The costs have gone up, and they've gone up globally, right? It's not just in one country where things have increased in price. People are now understanding that they can hire. Now, whether the managers are good enough to be able to manage multicultural teams and understand really what it means is a totally different matter. So, for example, I've got my team currently resides in Latvia, Germany, India, and South Africa, and me in London, right? And we're about to hire in Portugal. Now, each of those countries have their own differences, obviously. But, for example, hiring in South Africa, there's a huge issue with power. So there's the thing called load shedding, which means that the people can be without power for 12 hours. Right. Now, if you're a manager who doesn't know this and doesn't understand that this can happen, yeah, especially if you're running tight deadlines, right? Yeah. It's okay for us because we knew this was an issue, so we work around it. Similar in India, when there's a lightning storm, people power off their laptops because they don't want to get electrocuted. It's happened. It's actually happened to one of my team members. So there's all these sort of nuances that can happen, and you've got to really be aware of it. You can't assume that everybody's like you, and you can't assume that everyone has the same infrastructure set up. I'm sitting here with 3 screens, right? Most of my team are not. Not because I'm not paying for them, by the way, but it's because it's just they don't have space, right?
Lightning hitting them at that point, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do you feel? How do you find this stuff out though? Do you have to go out there and meet people? Is it through just Google research, speaking to people? How do you learn about these different kind of culture thing, international cultures that you have to?
Yeah, I mean, I was very big believer in either bring them to you or go to them, right? So if you're going to go, so a good example was when we were ramping up the team at this fintech that we'd raised money for, right? And we had the choice of the world back in 2013, 14, right? You go anywhere. And so I narrowed down the shortlist. I started talking to people, obviously through my network. I knew a few people here and there, but I just kind of randomly Googled places and got some of my team. And back then there were actually other brokers could help you out as well, which is very interesting, but that's a different topic. And so what I decided to do there is, you talk to them and then you just, I know it was a bit of a jolly as well, but you go out and meet people. We ended up in Portugal back then. And even then I got people, I got my team to work out in the offices of the companies that we were looking to work in nearshore for them to spend a week there and get a feel of those businesses and understand a little bit more because they would be managing people directly. And once we got the teams onboarded, I went down for a month and my senior team were like, there was always someone out there. I ended up moving there to Portugal, but other people kind of spent a long time there, right? And we sent people away backwards and forwards. Similarly, India's a little bit different, a bit harder sometimes to get visas, but we try and make sure that people are moving, or I go out there as and when I can, just to make sure that people understand that, I am real, not just an image on the screen. So you do. I think the key thing is to always talk to people who've done it before and understand the issues that you might face. And there's no substitute for experience, right? So you've got to seek out those people who've done it before and never take the face value of anyone that's selling to you, right? Which is plain obvious.
So you're saying anyone who's considering, it's not as simple as maybe just going on LinkedIn and approaching someone and hiring someone, but you really should get to know a bit more about that specific location and the issues and challenges you have hiring people in that space.
There's a huge amount of due diligence you need to do, depending. I mean, of course, it depends on how you see yourself as a business, right? But for example, let's take India as a good example. I worked for IBM. I went out to India to train some of the guys in the early days back in 2000, 2001, right? So it's 20 odd years ago. And if you look at some of the Indian companies selling their software developers, a lot of those companies are really treating their employees like really bad, right? They've got bad conditions that they're working in. They're working very long hours. They have their contracts are quite onerous and they're locked in. Some of them are actually locked in for a year, 2 years. It can be. Yeah. And so you've got to really, and you can't know that by talking to the guy who's in a nice room on a Zoom meeting. You just don't know that. So you've got to do a little bit of, you've got to meet the teams themselves. So you've got to try and make sure that you put in front of the people who will be working for you. You've got to try and gauge how that team is put together in itself and how well they can work. And other people that are working for you, have they ever worked together, right? Do they have a manager? Do they have something? How are they being managed? there's a whole bunch of nuance. I mean, again, working with teams in Vietnam, very different to anywhere else, really. But again, with guys who on my team had spent a lot of time in Vietnam, so understood the nuances. But you really need to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the background of the businesses, how they work, how they operate, how they treat their staff, because that's the problem. Never comes from you yourself in the sense that you as a company, it'll be coming from the company in the middle that's employing them. And I've had instances where huge number like staffs would just rotate really quickly. You're like, why are these guys? Why do they only spend 2 months with you, right? And it takes twigs quite quickly, but you kind of want to know that beforehand, right? If people are there's a massive churn on their employee rate.
So is that more for IBM? You've gone to for like client sites or sort of third party or outsourced?
IBM, we were working for a big client in the UK, and I was out there because IBM India were providing some of the staff back in those days. And so
I was there. It's not necessarily IBM treating them this way, but it's the
no, IBM, they were very good actually.
Yeah. So when it comes to, I guess, if you are like a startup and you're going to use a third party technology solution, you also want to get to know the business and how the developers and whatnot are being treated and what the culture's like there to ensure you're not having turnover in even the third party situation. Or
exactly, yeah. So the whole point really is that you need to understand. So you're going to get a great spiel from the people that are selling to you, right? Always are. What you really need to do is try and spend some time with the developers on their own without their managers. Simply because they're the team who's going to be working for you. You need to understand how they are. Now, they're obviously not going to tell you that they're getting treated badly, right? They're not going to do that, but you can always get a sense of it. And once you start, you get
one or two private conversations, you get a feeling, won't you?
The sense of communication, right? And you'll see how they are. They're quite timid. And again, it's got to be, you've got to have people there that match your culture as well. And I think a lot of people just throw out the work and expect it to get done. And that could be could work well and fine for you. But if you're looking to create a long-term relationship, you need to ensure that the company that you're employing is treating them well enough so that they do stay long-term, because your knowledge resides in people, not in the business, right? Is in the other company that you're hiring.
So if you're and you're a startup or whatnot, and you want to hire someone specifically to work for you, but internationally, what do you think the process is there? I guess in terms of like motivations or trying to attract talent, what should employers or what should hiring managers be sort of considering?
So it depends on the situation you're in, right? So if you're a startup that is just starting out, a lot of people
maybe not even a startup, maybe just a normal tech team, and they want to branch out and maybe use more international developers, for instance.
So there's a few things around if you're looking like augmenting your team, right? So if you're deciding on that you've got a team of 3 or 4 and you need to bring in another 4 or 5 quite quickly, there's a number of different ways you can do it. The very basic is you're nearshoring or you're offshoring or you're hiring directly, right? Hiring directly is getting a little bit easier, but it's still quite costly if you're not going to set up companies out there. There's platforms. Let's Deal is one, and there's another one I know that just became a unicorn based in Portugal. I've forgotten what its name is, but if you look up Portuguese unicorns, you'll find it. So when you're looking at hiring individually, you've really got to figure out I guess with each of them, you've got to figure out which country you want to go to, right? And that can depend on time zones. Are you looking at offshoring it completely to somewhere like India or Vietnam or China or Malaysia? And so you're going for all cost benefit there, or are you looking for something slightly closer to home so that if you need to fly out, you can fly out there? What are your real motivations? Do you need to have everything in the EU, right? Can you hire people in Ukraine simply because a lot of your data needs to reside in the EU? So therefore your infrastructure costs become a little bit more because you are having to deal with data not moving in and out, and they have to work on their own virtual machines or whatever it is, right? So I think there's a lot of kind of cultural, structural things you need to think about. What kind of wage can you afford? What skills are you looking for? Certain countries have more of certain skills than others, let's say. So it's no different from hiring a person in your own country in the sense that you kind of, you got to set your budget, you've got to set the working methodologies and all this other stuff. And then, it's the way I look at it is
the logistics side of it.
Logistics,
well,
yeah, exactly. So
paying and stuff, and that's just extra costs and hassle on top, isn't it?
Yeah. So then when it comes to the country itself, it's really then up to you to go and figure out, do you need a constant are you going to need a large number of developers, right? If you're going to go for a large number of developers, then places like Croatia, Slovenia, Slovakia may not be so great for you, right? Because they're just not that pool of talent. You can't go to Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Well, Estonia's a bit different because that would be very expensive. You've got a lot of unicorns paid very well out there. So the talent pool isn't so much. But if you're looking to get a team of 100, then Portugal might be interesting, or Spain might be interesting, or even France. And so but if you're looking to set up a team of 2, then actually it doesn't really matter where they are, right? As long as you're getting the right quality of people. If you're looking to get cheaper, then you can go further east you go, the less expensive it becomes. But again, it depends on, it depends on whether you're doing it yourself or whether you're doing it through a third party.
Is there when you are looking at, I guess, deciding who you want to hire and the key sort of skills and traits of that individual, do you look at somebody who has to work remotely and internationally? They have to have slightly different traits than somebody that you would have in office, or?
Yes, slightly. It's easier to hire the seniors and manage them remotely than the juniors, because the juniors will, a lot of times, if you've got a number of different developers in one place, then you can have a nice mix. But the juniors tend to need more support, and if you're not geared up to be able to give them that support as and when they need it, then you're going to find that like a big overhead, right? So it's easier then to manage a senior team remotely than it is obviously to manage a junior team. And I think there are certain types of people that work remotely better. I mean, most developers like to be left alone just to get on with their thing, right?
Put them in the corner.
Yeah. But then with testers, they may need more interaction with the business, right? Because of the fact that they need to understand the business more. So you might want to have them closer to home than the developers. And that's what I did that's what I tend to do I tend to have business analysis and testing in-house or close to in-house, and then development can be done a little bit out-house, and then bring in specialists for things like AI, ML, whatever it is needed.
Oh, interesting. And specifically with startups, is there when you're hiring someone to work in a startup compared to if you was hiring to work in a development team at IBM or PwC, what type of people do you think thrive better in startups? And is there any, if someone's looking to hire for their own startup, what sort of traits should they be looking for in a technology team?
It depends a little bit on how organized you are, right? Most people working at larger companies like the stability of that steady paycheck and the fact that they're going to go into work and they know what they're going to do, right? And they know how they're going to do it. In a startup world, you might be happily developing one product feature, and then someone comes in and says, well, no, don't need this anymore. Scrap what you've done. We're going to do something completely different, right? And if that's something that you don't like that kind of change, that constant, it's not constant change, but you don't like that. Yeah. And if you aren't quick to learn new things, right? Because it may well be that you suddenly have to do a completely different, not necessarily technology, but like just working in a whole new sector and a whole new thing that you might have to learn, right? And if you can't do that quickly, then you're probably not going to enjoy the startup life so much. But again, it does depend. As the startups grow and you start bigger teams, then it becomes more like a traditional business, right? And you'll have people who are set jobs, and because the team scales up to a certain level, that it just becomes business as usual, and you're not running around trying to do fighting fires or doing 15 different things. Because again, you might, as a developer in a startup, you might be doing a bit of DevOps as well as UI UX as well as back end coding, right?
Yeah, you kind of got to do a bit of everything sometimes and really provide as much value as you can across the whole.
And one of the key things is that a lot of people are perfectionists. A lot of developers are perfectionists, right? So they may have the talent in something, but they won't do it. I meet plenty of developers that don't want to do front end work because, I'm not good at it. But once you actually get them to do it, they're pretty good. But because they don't feel that they're the best, they don't want to do it. And so that's not helpful in a startup world, because you just sometimes need people just to get on and do it, even if they don't feel that they're great at it.
Well, what's your thoughts about full stack and back end, front end? Do you think people should be more full stack, or do you think you should have specialists in each area?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? I think if you're going to do something very complicated for want of a better word, right? If you're going into natural language processing or image recognition, those kinds of things, then you want to be more in that niche and understand more about that world, because the rate of the speed of improvement and speed of development in those industries mean that you kind of have to be on top of it. You can't then suddenly go off and do something else. But from a full stack, let's say .NET developer, it's useful to understand understand all the different parts of the stack in order to know how they all fit together. But you don't have to be a Xamarin developer if you all you want to do is deal with identity Or...
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so I just want to touch on one thing as well. I think I'm not saying it's a common thing, but I do tend to find a lot of sort of fresh grads or sort of younger, newer generation in technology do tend to gravitate towards startups and that kind of culture and environment. In terms of like a CTO and a manager, how have you seen, I guess, the culture and this kind of next generation of developers, and how, in terms of like motivating them, training them, handling them in general, have you seen any changes at all? What leaders should maybe consider with the new generation of developers coming out?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've got some youngsters on our team now, right? And they're less mercenary than some of the ones that are,
Right.
that are a little bit older. But having said that, obviously everyone wants to be paid. And again, it's a little bit cultural as well. In some of the countries that I used to work in, the younger developers just like the cachet of being a developer. A friend of mine in Bulgaria said the guys, 20 years ago, the guys driving the tinted BMWs were the gangsters, and now they're the developers, right? And so there's a bit of that. But I think a lot is made of the table tennis, ping pong tables, and snooker tables. That is nice, I think, but people just ultimately want to be treated fairly, right? They want the flexibility, and I think you're seeing that in the younger generation more. Obviously, the older generation wants that, but they're less used to having it, or it's kind of a novelty for them. Whereas I think it's harder for that, harder to motivate the younger generation if you're just going to sit and shout with them and dictate work.
Yeah.
I think there's got to be a little bit more knowledge sharing, context, putting things more into context. But again, that's a good thing, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Everyone should be trying to do that. And I think there's a lot of financial benefits you can give to that generation, and especially in learning an opportunity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, my guys who are younger, they don't mind working long hours. Not that I'm making them do that, but they don't mind working long hours if it's a new technology or something new that they learn, and they feel that they're learning and they feel they're progressing. But again, I think that's probably an intergenerational thing anyway, right? I think every generation wants that. I just think that overall, yes, they are concerned about money, but they're concerned about doing things that they are interested in and have some sort of impact.
And so again, when deciding to hire someone, you think someone who's really passionate about technology and someone who's really bought into the product and what you're doing specifically is going to be a key trait.
I tend to just hire when it's whether they like what we do or not is, it's bonus if they do.
Oh, really?
But they don't always necessarily understand what we do, right? Because and from the outside, it's not always easy to understand really how the mechanism work inside. What I do tend to do is I always try to gauge the curiosity of the person beyond their CV, right? So what have they done? What are the projects they've worked on outside of their core day-to-day work? And I had a team in Norway where pretty much every single person had a side project going on, had a side hustle. Like one guy had a side business that he started up while he was working for us, and he's doing really well now, right? He quit this job and went and did that, which is fantastic because he started learning about a whole bunch of new systems, which in effect helped him in his day job. Now, obviously for the company, it didn't help because he left, but but that's good, right? So that curiosity is there, and you're developing and you're learning and adding new skills in. And I think that for me is the most important thing, because I think, I've discussed this with other people before, and we talk about being a developer is like being a bus driver now, right? It's just a job for a lot of people. But when we started out, it was really very new and very interesting, and we wanted to do something. And I think if you could still find those people still exist, people building stuff with their own pies. That's the key. If they're motivated in doing other things and learning something completely tangential to what they do on a daily basis, that's a great.
Yeah, we find that a lot. Working in the recruitment industry, it's quite surprising sometimes when candidates don't put their personal projects on their CVs, and we really dig deep into what they do. And it turns out on the GitHub or repositories they have is some really like interesting personal projects, and a lot of times that is some of the biggest things that our clients actually buy into, is what they do in their personal time and the experience that they've gained. I mean, I placed someone probably about a year ago, not so much involved in recruitment anymore, but he didn't do computer science like yourself. I think he did a master's in languages, and he didn't have any experience, but he had this beautiful Node.js full stack travel app, and it was great. And that was the reason that he always got the job in the startup, purely because of the personal project. So for any developers out there, or anyone who is anyone really, do stuff in your personal time and really use that as ammunition towards your profile when looking for new jobs as well, for sure. So one thing I wanted to touch on as well, because I think there's a lot of people who maybe work for larger businesses like the IBMs or PwCs or whatever it might be, and they might be considering taking the transition from that kind of environment into a startup environment. So someone like yourself who's done that, what sort of advice would you give people in terms of when they're I guess, deciding what company to join? Maybe they'd be a startup. What stuff should they be taking into consideration?
I think it's a big difference if you're joining a very early stage to one that has received its funding and is moving on to the next stage, right? So if these are real early stage, maybe got some seed funding, there's a lot more risk to that than someone who's got maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 million in the bank and knows that they can secure it.
In terms of the funding and what stages they're at.
And I think for someone coming, a lot of it depends on your life situation as well, right? I mean, you're going from something. I'm not going to say IBM was a job for life, because I think they fired everyone over 40 just last year, right? But
specifically the age group.
Yeah, so they did a thing in the US. Yeah, no, well, I think US you can do, right? But the US they downsized, and anyone over 40 ended up getting culled in certain areas. And so I think that's it used to be a job for life. Obviously, it's not now. But the thing is, if you are family, kids, steady paycheck is what you need. A startup is not necessarily for you, right? Because even though a company might have funding, it could still go bust in a couple of years. One company I invested in, they raised 2 million, and a year later they've gone bankrupt, right? Now there's an interesting story behind that. I don't know what it is, but I've got to find out. Yeah. But I think there is an inherent risk in any startup, and most startups fail. So within 5, I think 97% fail after 3 years, and after 5 years, only another 10% of those succeed, right? So it's you. But if you want to learn a lot and get involved with many different aspects of the business, then a startup is fantastic. I mean, me, CTO of a fintech in 2012-13, I learned a huge amounts of non-technical stuff, which is great because it helps me in going forwards when I'm running businesses, starting my own business, right? But I think if you're looking for security, pension, all of this kind of stuff, right, then startup isn't necessarily for you. And don't be wooed by the shares unless it is a company that has actually got a value, because the shares are meaningless until there's an exit, right?
Right.
And
okay.
you might
shares not necessarily that valuable until you actually sort of done your research on them and see.
Exactly. And depending on your investing. So, these are all nice things, but if you're going in at a junior level, it could be good because you get to learn a lot of different things. But if there's not enough senior support, you may not have the people there with the experience to know what to do when things go wrong, or to understand how to deal with challenges and risks and mitigate those risks, right?
Do you think working for a bigger business to start out with and then gaining experience there to move into a startup is more preferable, or do you think going straight into a startup is fine, or did you learn anything?
I think, I talked to a lot of people, and I actually talked to one of my friends. She's set up businesses in Australia and Canada and US, and we talked about this. And I think the training that we got at PwC was fantastic, and that has really helped us. And we, if you find someone that has worked with that kind of background and can come into your business, then fantastic, because there's a methodology there, right? And then you don't necessarily understand that methodology until you're out of that system, but it's a great one for you setting up your business. Now, I'd caveat that by saying, if you're there for too long, you're useless to me, right? If you've been there for 15, 20 years, I don't really want to deal with you, because you only know one thing. Yeah. And I think what was very, very interesting was that I've been on both sides of the table. So I've been a consultant for 5, 6 years, and then I've been a CTO for, I don't know, 12, 13 years, right? And when I look at consultants now, I realize how little they know about business. They know nothing. They've never run a P&L. They don't know how a balance sheet looks. They don't have to deal with wages or anything like that. So they might know about a specific area and topic, and if they stick to that, fantastic. But if they start advising you about your business, then no. So if you want to be a bit more rounded, then I would suggest you go into a company. Actually, it's a bit like being a lawyer, right? You can be a corporate lawyer, but until you get and become general counsel, you don't see all the different things that are going on.
Right. Yeah, and we find that it's the exactly same with recruitment. I think bigger recruitment businesses, very structured training program, brilliant, but you get pigeonholed into a very particular market space. Don't necessarily get that exposure to much more of the business. No, interesting. So touching on, I guess, talking about you being a CTO of startups, in terms of like deciding technology or building tech, I guess aligning the tech and the business side of things, is there any advice you'd give, or what would you sort of tell other CTOs doing the same things?
Yeah, don't go for glory. I think the thing is that a lot of people try and go for the latest and greatest. What you've got to remember is, if your business takes off and you're using a technology that's just come out that doesn't have great support, that doesn't really have many developers, it's going to be really hard for you to grow that team, right? And essentially, if you're going for the newest JavaScript technology that's come out, one of the 50 million that have just turned up, right? And you're
like React
fully
18 or something now, isn't it? I don't even know where we're at anymore.
So if you're fully behind that and you're going for it, then remember that if you scale your team, there may not be anyone in the market to go and hire.
That's really interesting.
So then you're actually going to
just choosing the shiny, bright new technology that no one's had exposure to or whatnot. It does really limit your chances. And from someone who does work in the recruitment industry, and you mentioned this at the start of the podcast, there's more clients, there's more companies hiring software developers than there are developers at the moment, and you want to have a bigger pool of candidates for sure in terms of if you're trying to grow your team. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think give up some of the snobbery that's around there. There's a huge amount of snobbery when it comes to open source and this, that, and that, and this .NET open source, etc. Really, what you've got to decide as a CTO of the business, you've got to figure out what's best for the business, right? And you've got to ensure that you are able to, if the company grows and just scales, and you need to start going into new territories and start doing new things, you're able to do that, and there's enough knowledge and skills within the team to be able to do that. So I think, if you're looking to align, to step back a bit, if you're looking to align your business and tech strategy, right, you as a CTO have to understand the business, right? You can't just be sitting there going, I'm IT, I don't know about business. You've got to get more involved in that and think more strategically rather than keeping your head down. The first years of the startup, I would say the first year and a half, 2 years, you're thinking operationally, but as you get into the third year and the business hits 3 years, because a lot of businesses don't survive 3 years, then you're moving more strategically, because no matter what anyone says, and I know I'm going to get killed for this, your strategy is rubbish really in the first 6 months, because until you're out there, that you don't know that strategy is really gonna stick. So what you've got to really concentrate is on your operations and know your risks in your business. And so many CTOs don't really think about what are the actual risks, things that can go wrong. We come across tech stacks platforms that we take over where there's been no security audits done. There's been no real there's no encryption of data. They haven't thought about what happens if you decide to go into make it multilingual. These are really basic things you can do very early on, right? Create those structures to allow you to be flexible. You don't have to make it multilingual first on, but reverse engineering that in is as hard. Also, your operational piece, don't forget how to monitor your platforms, right? All the logging, error mechanisms, failover, that can be that if that's done early and well, that will save you a lot of bother further down the line. And I've got plenty of war stories that we could spend another couple of hours on, of things that have gone wrong in businesses. And I think the key is just to de-risk that business as much as possible, and that is in many different areas that you need to de-risk.
So it's taking a step back at the beginning, really thinking forward and analyzing what the risks may be, and making sure you've got the foundations there and the operations in place so that you can be you haven't got to sort of backtrack, or you can be scalable fairly easily. Or
you've got to remember, right? CTOs are the worst jobs ever. No one knows this. Who's the CTO of Microsoft? Who's the CTO of Oracle, right? You're the guys who keep the lights on, and no one really cares about you until something goes wrong.
Right? Yeah.
You'll get no guns and glory. There's none of that. All that happens is if something goes wrong, you're the first one to be fired, right? So you've got to become a risk maniac.
That's interesting. It's really interesting. And we've on this, I think we touched on it earlier, but on the subject of technical debt, what's your viewpoint in technical debt?
It's inevitable, right? It's going to happen. So as long as you keep a track of it and understand that it exists, and that you know that you need to go and fix those problems, just don't hide it away. Just say, okay, it needs to be done. Let's go and do it. Now, again, one of my pet hates is that a lot of times, we'll be in a beauty parade and we'll see some reports that have come from other companies who've done due diligence on a business, right? And they'll just say, oh, we have to throw it all away. Now, you don't always have to throw everything all away, right? The whole job again of a CTO is to go and look in there and say, okay, what can we really salvage? What can we pick? What can we build on? What needs to go? And what do we need to improve, right, going forwards? And I think technical debt is something that's always going to happen. Not all your developers are going to be at the same speed or the same skill level. You're going to have to make decisions to get things out quicker than you want to. Just keep a track of it all, and know that when you do, the worst thing that happens, and I see this in a huge, like we've been doing some monolith, so breaking down some monoliths into microservices and things like that. What ends up happening is that everyone just hides their kind of little things that they've done. Yeah, and that's what will kill you in not in the first 3 years.
So it's just keeping a track of it and then making sure you're kind of dealing with it as you go. But it is, as you say, it's inevitable. You have certain deadlines to hit and whatnot, and you just need to be careful and decide when and as when to accumulate technical debt and deal with it as and when. So it's not too much of a hassle later down the line. One final thing as well. So we talked about. I think there's especially with like Silicon Valley, it's like, these Ubers or whatnot, none of them ever are profiting because they're constantly reinvesting in their technology and whatnot. So someone who advised startups in terms of stepping into the market, and when do businesses actually kind of profit? When can you expect to do that? I know it probably differs, but in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, it does differ, but generally most businesses aren't profitable for the first 2-3 years, right? I mean, like for example, Atom, we were profitable from day one, but we were quite lucky in the sense that we had a pre-existing network and set of people that wanted to buy from us. So, and we had a very low operational footprint, right? So it depends on your business for sure, but generally you should ensure that you've got enough money in the bank for the first 18 to 24 months, and then expect a raise after the next 12 months if you've managed to hit your sales targets. It's hard in this environment, right? I mean, generally it's hard to create profitable businesses, but be patient. And it's one of those things, like I said, it's the business will go at its own pace. You can't force it.
So having a CFO or someone responsible for budgeting and really keeping an eye on that, and responsible for funding and further seeding is obviously vital. Another partner that's obviously needed in the startup business.
100%. I think the more senior head you can get in early on. You don't need to have them the whole way through, right? But you need those, especially if you've never run a business before. You need those advisors early on just to kind of help you set a framework, and then you can do whatever it is you want to do within the framework. But at least you then get an understanding of how you should operate finances, how you should operate tech, how you should operate sales, and set yourself some targets and goals, right? I think that's the key. A lot of people don't do that. When I ask them, like, okay, so why are you doing this? What are you going to get out of it? ROI is a huge pet peeve for me, because the amount I talk to people about ROI, like, why, especially when it comes to tech, and I say it's going to cost you, X amount to put this new feature in. What do you think that feature is going to do for you as a business? How many new customers will you get from it? No one has an answer. And so why are we doing it? Right. So that's I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying, why are we doing it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. But anyway.
No, interesting. Cool. So thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I know as well. So you actually host your own podcast as well. Atom CTO.
It's Atom Ventures podcast.
And who do you have on there? What do you sort of discuss on there?
So I've been doing a number of founder stories recently. So I've been actually interviewing a number of non-technical founders who've built on low code, no code. So they've gone without any kind of technical help, any technical CTOs, and they've built their own things, which has been really interesting actually to see how they've done. And then
Did you listen to their stories and think, if you had asked me for a bit of advice, I would have maybe done that slightly differently, or have they done it?
Well, no, they've done well, but I think what the two key takeaways are that low code, no code is not as easy as everyone thinks it is. And B, the thing is, do you really want to spend your time messing around building an app when you should be going out and getting customers? That's really the key, right? But that's up to you, and it's up to guys I know. They've done very well, but they've put a lot of sweat and tears into
their journey.
Something. But then they've also learned about the value of tech, which is great, because they've learned what it means to do it now. So they know that they're going to prize someone who can come and do it. They're going to actually value that person. So there's that. And we've been doing a few demystifying pieces. A lot of it is generally business, entrepreneurship. And so it's not always tech focused. It's actually not much tech focused. It's really more business focused and helping entrepreneurs get through the crazy times of a startup.
No, great stuff. I think everyone can find you at www.atomcto.com. Is that right?
atomcto.com is where all of the podcasts are, or on SoundCloud under Atom Ventures, and LinkedIn Atom CTO, and Twitter Atom CTO.
No, perfect. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.